The broken silence. Officer James Carter's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he continued to drive through the dimly lit streets of Millbrook. He had always appreciated the town's quiet charm, the peace that came from living in a place where everyone knew each other. But tonight, that calm felt more like a weight pressing down on him. The silence inside his patrol car was deafening, the ticking of the clock on the dashboard a constant reminder that time was slipping away from him, that he was growing older, and that life was not the same without Mela. The past few months had been nothing short of a blur. After his wife's death, everything that once mattered felt hollow. The house they had built together, filled with memories of shared laughter and plans for the future, now stood as a monument to what was lost. James hadn't even bothered to pack away her things. Her clothes still hung in the closet, and her scent still lingered in the pillows of their bed. He couldn't bring himself to change anything, couldn't bear to erase the remnants of her presence. He'd tried to stay busy, to keep his mind occupied with work. But the truth was, the job had lost its purpose. Every shift was the same, every face was a blur. He'd been a cop for 15 years, but nothing could have prepared him for the emptiness that consumed him after Milo was gone. He had always been the strong one, the protector. But now he felt fragile, like a threadbare coat that could unravel at any moment. His thoughts shifted again to his wife. He remembered the day they moved to Millbrook, bright-eyed, full of hope. They had both been so excited to start their new life here. James had always dreamed of a quiet life in a small town, and Mila had shared that dream. They had found a house on Elm Street, a charming little cottage with a white picket fence and a sprawling backyard. It was the perfect place to raise a family, to grow old together. But those dreams felt distant now, as if they belonged to someone else. The first few weeks after Mila's death had been the hardest. The funeral had been a blur of faces, handshakes, and condolences, but none of it had felt real. James had been in a haze, moving through the motions of grief, too numb to process the magnitude of his loss. The nights were the worst, when the silence in the house seemed to echo her absence. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every moment felt like an eternity. But tonight, as James drove through the streets of Millbrook, something felt different. A strange sense of unease had settled over him, a quiet stirring that he couldn't quite shake. He found himself driving slower than usual, his eyes scanning the empty streets for something, anything, to break the monotony. As he approached the park, he noticed a faint flicker of movement in the distance. It wasn't unusual to see someone walking the paths at night. Millbrook was a safe town, but something about this figure caught his attention. It was a child, or at least it looked like one. The figure moved quickly, darting between the shadows as if trying to avoid being seen. James's instincts kicked in, and he slowed the car to a crawl, his eyes narrowing. The park was empty this time of night. He had driven past it countless times during his shifts, and it was always quiet, still. The swings hung motionless, the benches stood unused, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind. But tonight, there was something different, something out of place. James pulled the patrol car to the curb, the tires crunching against the gravel. He switched off the engine and stepped out of the vehicle, his boots clicking against the pavement. His hand instinctively reached for the flashlight on his belt, the beam cutting through the darkness. He scanned the park, trying to locate the child. At first, he saw nothing. The park was as still as ever, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he caught a flicker of movement again. This time, it was closer. The boy was darting from one tree to another, his small figure blending into the shadows. James's heart skipped a beat. "Hey," he called out, his voice firm, but not aggressive. "Are you all right?" The boy froze mid-step, his head snapping in James's direction. For a split second, the boy's wide, frightened eyes met James's gaze before he turned and sprinted off, disappearing into the thicket of trees. James's heart raced. Without hesitation, he followed, his legs carrying him swiftly over the uneven ground. He called out again, his voice tinged with both concern and authority. "Stop! I'm not going to hurt you." But the boy didn't stop. Instead, he ran faster, his small body weaving through the shadows like a ghost. James pushed forward, the adrenaline kicking in as he chased after the boy, his breaths heavy with exertion. The park was large, but James knew it well. There were paths that wound through the trees, areas that led down to a small creek, and a dense grove of woods. James followed the sounds of the boy's footsteps, trying to keep up. He could hear the boy's breathing now, rapid and uneven, as though the child were in some sort of panic. As he rounded a corner near the edge of the park, James caught sight of the boy again. He was crouching behind a large oak tree, his body hunched, and his eyes darting around in fear. The moment the boy saw James, he scrambled to his feet and started to run once more. But James was closer this time. He called out again, his voice softer, trying to ease the boy's obvious fear. "Please, stop. I just want to help." The boy paused for a brief moment, his eyes locked on James, filled with a mixture of fear and confusion. It was then that James noticed something. There was no defiance in the boy's posture, no rebellion, just terror. It was as if the boy was trapped, as if he had no choice but to run. "Hey, it's okay," James said, his voice gentle now. He took a few cautious steps forward, not wanting to frighten the boy further. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to make sure you're okay." The boy seemed to hesitate, his eyes still wide with fear, but for the first time, he didn't run. Instead, he stepped backward slowly, his body tense, but he stayed rooted to the spot. James stopped in his tracks, giving the boy the space he needed. His heart was heavy, sensing that there was more to this than just a frightened child out past curfew. "I'm Officer James Carter," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. "Can you tell me your name?" For a long moment, the boy didn't speak. He just stared at James, as if weighing whether or not he could trust him. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the boy spoke in a small, trembling voice. "And Marcus," he said, his words barely audible. "Marcus Blackwell." James nodded slowly, his heart going out to the child. "All right, Marcus. What are you doing out here by yourself? It's not safe for someone your age to be alone in the park at night." Marcus didn't answer immediately. He just lowered his head, as if ashamed. James could see that the boy was fighting something inside himself, a battle between fear and the need for help. Finally, after a long silence, Marcus spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. I'm hiding," he said. "Hiding from what?" James asked, his concern deepening. Marcus's eyes flickered to the ground, and for a moment, James thought the boy wasn't going to answer. But then, with a shaking breath, Marcus spoke again, his voice cracked with emotion. "They said I don't belong. I don't have anywhere else to go." The words hit James like a cold wave. They told a story of a child lost, a child abandoned. His heart clenched as he knelt down to the boy's level, his voice soft but firm. "Marcus, you're not alone anymore," he said, reaching out slowly, offering his hand. "I'm here, and I'm not going to let anyone hurt you." For a moment, the boy simply stared at his hand, unsure. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he took it, and for the first time that night, James saw something in Marcus's eyes, a flicker of hope, the hidden truth. The dim glow of the patrol car's headlights cast long shadows across the park as James gently led Marcus toward the vehicle. The boy's small hand gripped his with a desperation that tugged at James's heart, but Marcus kept his eyes on the ground, as though ashamed of his presence, as though his very existence in this quiet park was something to be hidden away. James could feel the boy's trembling, and his mind raced with questions. How had he ended up alone, out here in the dark, scared and vulnerable? What had happened to him to bring him to this moment? As they reached the car, James opened the passenger door and gestured for Marcus to get inside. The boy hesitated for a moment, looking up at him with wide, uncertain eyes before climbing into the seat. He sat stiffly, keeping his arms pressed against his sides, his body language withdrawn. James closed the door behind him and circled around to the driver's side, sliding into his seat. Before James even started the car, he looked over at Marcus, who was staring out the window, lost in his thoughts. There was something about the way the boy held himself, as though he was trying to shrink away from the world, from the weight of whatever it was that had pushed him into hiding. The silence between them was thick, each second stretching into an eternity. James could feel the questions swirling in his mind, but he knew that the boy wouldn't open up easily. Not yet. Trust, especially after something like this, took time. So he decided to break the silence in the most non-invasive way he could think of. "You're safe now, Marcus," James said gently, his voice carrying warmth. "You're not in trouble. I just want to make sure you're okay." The boy didn't respond immediately, his eyes fixed on the streetlights outside the window, but James could see the faintest tremor in his hands. Then, finally, Marcus spoke, his voice small, barely audible above the hum of the engine. "I'm not supposed to be here," he said, his words filled with a deep sorrow. James's heart ached as he glanced at Marcus, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean by that?" Marcus hesitated for a moment, as though the words were difficult to form, as though they were tied to some painful memory that he was reluctant to relive. But eventually, he let out a shaky breath and spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't belong anywhere," Marcus said. "I don't have a family. I don't have a home. I don't know where to go." James's grip on the steering wheel tightened as he tried to process what he was hearing. A child, no older than 10 or 11, had been living in an abandoned park, alone and scared. The words hit him like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, all he could do was stare at the road ahead. He had seen a lot in his years as a cop, tragic stories, broken families, lost children. But something about Marcus's story felt different, more raw. The boy wasn't just lost. He had been cast aside. "Marcus, you've got to understand," James said, his voice firm but gentle, trying to break through the fog of the boy's despair. "You're not alone. You do belong. You've got people who care." Marcus shook his head slowly, the movement small but decisive. "No one cares about me," he muttered, his voice low and full of self-doubt. "Not anymore." James's mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened to this child. The coldness in his words, the sense of abandonment in his posture, it all pointed to something far more than a simple case of a runaway child. Something had driven Marcus to the brink, to the point where he thought there was no one left who cared about him. They'd reached the edge of town and James slowed the patrol car, the soft sound of the tires on the gravel breaking the tense silence. As he made the turn onto Elm Street, a thought flashed through his mind. Marcus's last words were the key. "No one cares about me." That wasn't something a child would say lightly. James parked the car outside the station, his mind still churning. He didn't want to press the boy too hard just yet. Whatever had happened to Marcus, it wasn't something that could be fixed in a single conversation. He needed time, but more importantly, he needed someone who would listen. Someone who would be there for him. Someone who could help piece together the shattered parts of his life. Before getting out of the car, James turned to the boy, who was still staring out the window, his small face barely visible in the dark. "I'm not going to let you go, Marcus," he said softly. "We'll figure this out. Together." Marcus nodded slowly, but his eyes remained distant, lost somewhere far away. He didn't look like he believed James, and who could blame him? How could a child who had been abandoned, ignored, and left to fend for himself trust anyone again? James reached over and gently touched Marcus's shoulder. "Let's get you inside. We'll figure out what's next." Marcus slid out of the car, his feet dragging as he followed James into the station. The building was quiet, save for the occasional shuffle of papers or the soft hum of a phone in the distance. It was late, and most of the officers had already gone home, But James needed a few minutes to figure out the next steps. He didn't know where Marcus had come from, but he was certain of one thing. This boy had a story to tell, and he was going to help him find his voice. Inside, James led Marcus to an empty office and motioned for him to sit in one of the chairs. Marcus hesitated but eventually sat down, his posture hunched, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. James turned on the lights and went to the small coffee machine in the corner of the room, making a cup for himself to steady his nerves. He didn't have the answers, but he couldn't leave the boy in the dark any longer. As he sat across from Marcus, James finally spoke, his voice low and calm. "You don't have to tell me everything right away, Marcus," he said, "but I need you to know something. You're safe here. Whatever happened to you, we'll take it one step at a time." Marcus looked up at James for the first time since they had arrived, his eyes filled with uncertainty. It was as if he was unsure of what this officer could really do for him. But there was something in James's eyes, something that spoke of genuine care, of a commitment to helping him. And for the first time, Marcus seemed to let his guard down, if only slightly. He took a deep breath, then spoke again, his voice shaky. "It's not just being alone," he said, his words faltering as he struggled to find the right ones. "It's everything that happened before. The things that made me think I wasn't worth anything." James's heart clenched again as he saw the boy's vulnerability. This wasn't just a case of a runaway child. This was something deeper, something more painful. Marcus had experienced something that no child should ever have to endure. "Marcus," James said gently, "I know you're scared, but I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. We'll take it slow. Just tell me what you can, when you're ready." Marcus's eyes flickered toward the floor again, his face shadowed with fear, but for the first time, there was a glimmer of hope in his gaze, hope that maybe, just maybe, someone could help him carry the weight of the world he had been forced to carry all alone. Unraveling the past. The silence in the small office was almost unbearable, thick with the weight of unspoken truths. Marcus sat across from James, his legs pulled close to his chest, arms wrapped tightly around his knees as though trying to hold himself together. James, for his part, sat quietly, watching the boy with a mixture of empathy and determination. There was so much more to Marcus's story, James could feel it. The boy had been through something no child should ever have to endure, something that had shaped him into the withdrawn, fearful child James had found in the park. But what? James leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle yet firm. "Marcus, you don't have to tell me everything at once. But if you're ready, I'm here to listen. Whatever you've been through, we'll get through it together. You're not alone anymore." Marcus lifted his head, his eyes meeting James's for the first time in what felt like hours. There was still hesitation in his gaze, a wall built up around him. But James could see something else there too. An ache, a longing for something he couldn't name. The boy opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into the fabric of his worn hoodie, and James could see the struggle in his eyes, the internal battle between fear and the desperate need to unburden himself. I don't know where to start," Marcus finally said, his voice shaking. "I don't even know what happened. It feels like it's all a blur." James nodded, trying to offer him a reassuring smile. "We don't have to figure everything out right away. Just tell me what you can, whatever you're comfortable with." Marcus took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as he tried to steady himself. It's just that I don't know who to trust anymore." He looked down at his hands, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was living with my aunt and her boyfriend. I thought they were going to help me. I thought maybe they could give me a home, But they didn't." James's heart sank. He had heard stories of neglect and abuse, of children abandoned by the very people who were supposed to protect them. But hearing it firsthand, especially from such a young child, was a different kind of pain. It twisted inside of him, making him wish he could erase everything the boy had gone through. "Marcus," James said softly, leaning forward again. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that. But you don't have to go through this alone anymore. You've got people who care." "I care." Marcus swallowed hard, the tears brimming in his eyes threatening to spill over. "I thought she was going to protect me. My aunt. She promised me that she'd keep me safe. But then things started changing. Her boyfriend. He started saying things. Mean things. And then he started doing things. Things I couldn't stop." The word hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, the room seemed to fall away. James felt the full weight of Marcus's pain, the shattered trust that had been torn apart by people who were supposed to care for him. It was a darkness so deep, so insidious, that James could hardly fathom how it had crept into the boy's life, how it had corrupted his sense of safety, of home. Did anyone else know?" James asked, his voice low, careful. Marcus shook his head, his face pale with the memory of what he was sharing. "I didn't tell anyone. I couldn't. I thought if I told someone, I'd just make it worse. They'd get angry, and it'd all be my fault." James clenched his jaw, fighting back the rising tide of anger that surged through him. This wasn't just a case of neglect or abandonment. This was something far darker, something that had scarred Marcus in ways that would take years to heal, if ever. But right now, in this moment, James knew that the most important thing he could do was make sure Marcus felt safe, truly safe. "You did the right thing by coming to me, Marcus," James said gently, his voice steady and firm. "And you're not responsible for what happened to you. None of this was your fault." Marcus's eyes flickered up to meet James's, and for the first time since their conversation had begun, James saw a spark of something in the boy's eyes, a flicker of hope, fragile but real. The boy didn't respond right away, but he nodded slightly, as though the weight of his own guilt was beginning to lift, just a little. James sat back in his chair, taking a moment to let the gravity of what Marcus had shared sink in. He could feel the boy's pain, but there was also something else there, a resilience, a strength that James hadn't expected to find in such a young child. It was a strength born of survival, a strength that had kept Marcus going even when the world had tried to break him. It was that strength, that spark of determination, that made James more determined than ever to help him. "What happened after that?" James asked quietly, his voice soft but insistent. "After you started feeling like you couldn't stay there anymore." Marcus wiped his eyes quickly, as if embarrassed by the tears that had begun to fall. "I ran away," he whispered. "I didn't know where else to go. I just knew I couldn't stay there anymore. It was too scary, and I didn't feel safe anymore. So, I left. And I ended up here." James's chest tightened as he absorbed the weight of Marcus's words. A child, no more than 10 or 11, had been so terrified of the people who were supposed to care for him that he had run into the unknown, into the cold night, with no plan, no direction, just the desperate need to escape. The boy had been searching for safety, searching for a place where he could just breathe, just be a kid again. "You're so brave, Marcus," James said softly, his voice filled with admiration. "I don't think you realize just how brave you are. Most kids wouldn't have had the strength to do what you did." Marcus didn't respond. Instead, he stared down at his hands, his fingers trembling slightly. There was a weight to his silence, an unspoken understanding between them. But James could see the exhaustion in the boy's eyes. Marcus had carried this burden for too long, and it was clear that the relief of sharing his story with someone who wasn't going to judge him or hurt him, was beginning to wash over him, even if only a little. James sat quietly for a moment, giving Marcus the space he needed. The boy's breathing had steadied, but his body was still tense, as if he was waiting for the next blow to fall. But James knew that it was time to shift the focus, to let Marcus know that he was safe, that this wasn't the end of his journey, it was just the beginning. "You're not alone anymore, Marcus," James said firmly, his voice unwavering. "I'm going to make sure that no one hurts you again. I'm going to make sure you get the help you need, and we'll figure out what happens next, together." Marcus looked up at him, his eyes filled with uncertainty, but there was something else there too, something like trust. It was fragile, fleeting, but it was there. And for the first time, James saw a glimmer of peace in the boy's face, a small sign that he was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could have a future beyond the darkness he had lived in for so long. For the first time in a long while, James allowed himself to believe it too. The road to healing. The next few days were a blur for both Marcus and James. After Marcus had shared his heart-wrenching story, James had made arrangements for him to stay at a temporary safe house while they began investigating the details of his past. But it wasn't easy. Marcus, though safe from immediate harm, was still so fragile, like a bird with a broken wing, scared of trusting anyone, even those who genuinely wanted to help him. James had visited the safe house several times, checking in on Marcus, but each time the boy remained distant, withdrawn, as though the shadows of his past were still hanging over him, refusing to let him find peace. It was hard for James to watch the boy struggle, knowing that the emotional scars Marcus carried would take far longer to heal than any physical wounds ever could. That evening, after his shift had ended, James made his way to the safe house. He had grown accustomed to the awkward silences between them, but he refused to let Marcus slip through his fingers. The boy needed someone who would keep showing up, someone who wouldn't give up on him, no matter how many times he tried to push them away. As James stepped into the safe house, he was greeted by the soft hum of a radio in the corner, the light scent of cinnamon wafting through the air, and the comforting presence of the house's coordinator, a woman named Karen who had worked with foster children for years. She was warm and compassionate, but even she couldn't break through Marcus's walls, which remained as solid as ever. "James," Karen greeted him, offering a soft smile. "He's been quiet today. Haven't heard much from him since breakfast." "I figured," James replied, his voice tinged with concern. "He's had a lot to process. This isn't something you get over in a day." Karen nodded in understanding but said nothing more, clearly respecting the space that Marcus needed. James had already made it clear that he didn't want to rush the boy. It was going to take time for Marcus to process everything that had happened to him, to come to terms with the horrors of his past, and ultimately, to learn how to trust again. He walked through the small house, each room cozy and well-kept, designed to make children feel as safe and comfortable as possible. But the sense of warmth that filled the house seemed to bounce off Marcus, like it was something foreign, something he couldn't quite grasp. When James reached the back of the house, he found Marcus sitting on the couch, his back pressed against the cushions, his eyes staring out the window. His body language screamed isolation, his arms wrapped tightly around his knees, his head down, and his mind clearly somewhere far away. James approached the boy slowly, carefully, as if trying to navigate the fragile space between them. He didn't want to force anything. He knew that pushing too hard could make Marcus retreat further into himself. "Hey, Marcus," James said softly, taking a seat beside him. He didn't touch him, didn't try to physically comfort him. He knew that Marcus wasn't ready for that kind of closeness yet. "How are you feeling today?" Marcus didn't respond at first, his gaze fixed on the setting sun outside. The sky had begun to turn a soft shade of orange, and James could see the reflections of light dancing in Marcus's eyes, but they weren't filled with wonder. Instead, they seemed hollow, lost, as though he was seeing the world through a thick fog. "I don't know," Marcus said quietly after a long pause, his voice almost a whisper. "I don't feel anything." James's heart twisted in his chest. He feels numb, he thought. The boy had been through so much that his mind and body had learned to shut down, to protect him from the overwhelming pain. But that didn't mean the hurt had gone away. It was still there, buried deep inside. "Marcus," James said gently, his voice low and steady. "It's okay not to feel okay right now. You've been through a lot. But I want you to know that you're not alone. I'm here. I'll be here, every day, as long as you need me." Marcus's fingers twitched at the sound of James's voice, but he didn't look at him. Instead, he hugged his knees tighter, a subtle sign that the boy was trying to hold on to something, anything, to keep himself from falling apart. "I just wanted to stop," Marcus muttered, his words so quiet that James almost missed them. "I don't want to feel like this anymore. I don't want to feel empty." James didn't know what to say to that. He wanted to offer comfort, but the truth was, he didn't have all the answers. How do you fix something so broken? How do you tell a child who has been abused, neglected, and abandoned that everything will be okay when you know that the road ahead is long and full of challenges? All James could do was sit beside him, offering his presence, his steady support. The words would come later, when Marcus was ready to speak them. For now, James understood that silence was just as powerful, just as necessary for healing. "I'm not going anywhere, Marcus," James said, his voice firm with conviction. "You don't have to do this alone. And when you're ready, we'll talk. But no pressure. You take all the time you need." After a few moments of silence, Marcus turned his head ever so slightly, just enough for their eyes to meet. There was something in his gaze, something like a flicker of recognition, as though he was beginning to realize that maybe, just maybe, this man beside him wasn't like everyone else. Maybe James was someone he could trust, someone who wouldn't abandon him when things got tough. James held his gaze, not rushing, just waiting. He wasn't going to push. He was going to let Marcus come to him on his own terms. Slowly, Marcus shifted on the couch, turning toward James and lowering his head, as though he was ashamed of something. "I'm sorry," Marcus whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't mean to cause trouble. I didn't know where else to go." James's heart broke at the boy's apology, the guilt he still carried despite everything that had happened to him. "Marcus," James said gently, his voice filled with compassion, "you didn't cause any trouble. You're not in trouble. You never were. What happened to you wasn't your fault, and I want you to understand that. I'm just glad you're here now. That's all that matters." Marcus's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and for a brief moment, James thought he might cry. But the boy blinked rapidly, trying to hold back the flood of emotions that had been pent up for so long. He wasn't ready to let it all out yet, but James could see that he was starting to. And that, in itself, was progress. "I just want to feel safe," Marcus said, his voice so small, so fragile. "I just want to feel like I matter." "You do matter," James replied without hesitation. "You matter to me. You matter to everyone who's trying to help you." Marcus's lips trembled, but he didn't say anything more. He simply leaned back against the couch, his shoulders relaxing just a little bit. The tension that had been so evident in his posture started to ease, and for the first time, he allowed himself to rest, to trust that someone was there for him. The healing process had only just begun for Marcus, but James could see the first signs of progress. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but he was willing to stay by Marcus's side for as long as it took. Together, they would navigate the road ahead, one step at a time. And maybe, just maybe, Marcus would learn to believe that safety, trust, and even happiness were possible again. A fragile trust. The days stretched into weeks, and the small temporary safe house began to feel less like an unfamiliar, sterile space, and more like a fragile refuge for Marcus. The atmosphere had changed slowly, like the gradual warming of the earth after a long, cold winter. The silence that had once consumed Marcus began to give way to small, hesitant interactions. First a question about the weather, then a slight smile when James cracked a joke during one of his visits. It wasn't much, but it was progress, and James could see it. But as much as Marcus had started to open up, there were moments when the weight of his past still bore down on him, suffocating him in the darkness he was struggling to escape. There were nights when he would wake in a cold sweat, his eyes wide and panicked. And for a moment, James would catch the fleeting terror in the boy's gaze. The nightmares were still haunting him, the ghosts of his aunt's boyfriend lingering in his subconscious like shadows that refused to be shaken off. One evening, as the late afternoon sun filtered through the blinds, casting soft patterns of light across the floor, James arrived at the safe house to find Marcus sitting alone at the kitchen table, a half-eaten sandwich in front of him. His hands were trembling slightly as he reached for the glass of milk beside him, and the boy's gaze was distant, lost in some internal struggle that James couldn't fully understand. "Hey, Marcus," James greeted softly, trying to keep his voice light, even though he could feel that heaviness in the air. "You're up early today. Something on your mind?" Marcus didn't immediately respond. Instead, he stared at the glass of milk, his fingers tapping on the rim. It wasn't like the boy to be so withdrawn during the day. He had started showing small signs of progress, but now he seemed like he had regressed. James could see the tension in his posture, the way his shoulders were hunched in, as though he was trying to shrink away from the world. James took a seat across from him, careful not to crowd him. He knew that pushing Marcus too hard could send him retreating, but he also knew that the boy needed someone who wouldn't let him disappear into the shadows again. "Marcus, what's going on?" James asked gently. "You don't have to talk about it if you're not ready, but I want you to know that I'm here for you. You don't have to face this alone." The boy's eyes flickered up to meet James's, and for a brief moment, there was something vulnerable in his gaze, a rawness that James hadn't seen before. It was the first time in weeks that Marcus had looked him directly in the eye, and James felt his heart twist in response. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," Marcus finally said, his voice low and filled with an exhaustion that ran deeper than the physical weariness of a child. "I don't know if I can keep pretending that everything is going to be okay. I'm scared, James. I'm scared that one day I'll wake up and it'll all be gone. That I'll be left in the dark again." James felt the full weight of Marcus's words settle around him like a storm. The fear that had been growing in Marcus's heart, the fear of abandonment, of never finding a place where he truly belonged, was finally spilling out. And in that moment, James realized just how deep the boy's pain ran. It wasn't just the trauma of what had happened to him. It was the fear that it could all happen again, that the people who had promised to protect him would fail him once more. James leaned forward slightly, his voice steady but full of warmth. "Marcus, I'm not going anywhere. I know it's hard to trust people after everything you've been through, but you've got to believe me when I say that I'm here for the long haul. I'm not going to let you go. You're not going to lose me." Marcus's lip trembled, and James could see the struggle in his eyes. It was as though a part of him was still unsure if he could believe those words, if he could trust that someone would truly stay, no matter what. The boy had been let down too many times in the past to easily accept that things could be different now. "Why?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you stay? Why would anyone stay?" James took a deep breath, considering his answer carefully. "Because you deserve to be cared for, Marcus. You deserve to feel safe, to feel loved. I'm not just a cop to you. I'm someone who sees you, who sees the real you, not the things that have happened to you. You're worth fighting for. And that's why I'm here. To help you find your way out of the darkness." Marcus didn't speak for a long time. Instead, he let the silence hang between them, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him, as though processing everything James had said. Slowly, he reached for his glass of milk, taking a tentative sip, as though the action itself required a great deal of energy and courage. When he set the glass down, his hands were still trembling, but his posture had shifted slightly, the tightness in his shoulders loosening just a little. "I don't know if I can ever be normal again," Marcus said, his voice still filled with doubt. "I don't know if I can ever feel like I'm not broken." James felt a lump rise in his throat at the words. He had heard the same sentiment from other kids, other victims of trauma. Over the years, the belief that they were irreparably damaged, that their scars would never heal, was a heavy burden to bear. But James refused to let Marcus carry that burden alone. "You're not broken, Marcus," James replied firmly, his voice filled with conviction. "You're hurt, and you're healing, but you're not broken. And even when it feels like you are, even when the darkness feels too big to fight, remember this: you don't have to heal all at once. It's okay to take it one day at a time. I'm here every step of the way, and I believe in you." Marcus finally looked up at him, and this time, James saw something different in his eyes, something like a flicker of hope, barely visible but real. It was fragile, like a tiny flame in the wind, but it was there. And that was enough. "Thank you," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know if I believe it yet, but thank you for not giving up on me." James smiled, his heart swelling with emotion. "You don't ever have to thank me for that. You never have to thank me for being here." The two sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their conversation settling over them. It wasn't the end of Marcus's journey, not by a long shot, but it was a step forward, a sign that the boy was beginning to trust again, beginning to understand that there were people in his life who weren't going to let him fall. And as James watched Marcus sit a little straighter, the smallest hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, he allowed himself to believe, just for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, the boy would find his way out of the darkness after all. A new beginning. The days following that conversation were some of the most challenging and most rewarding for Marcus. Though the trust he had slowly started to build with James was fragile, it was something real. He could feel the slow, steady change in his heart, though he was still reluctant to fully embrace it. The weight of his past, everything he had endured, hadn't disappeared overnight. The trauma he carried didn't vanish in the flicker of hope that had lit his eyes just a few days ago. But something inside him had shifted. The mornings were still the hardest, waking up in a new space, surrounded by unfamiliar faces, and trying to piece together his broken world. But for the first time in months, Marcus didn't wake up in a cold sweat, thinking he was back in the nightmare. He woke up in a bed that wasn't the floor of an abandoned building. He woke up in a space where someone cared whether or not he was okay. That small, simple truth was enough to help him push through the toughest moments. Each day, Marcus grew more accustomed to the new routine that James had set up for him. It was never rushed, never forced. They took things one step at a time. There were mornings when James would bring breakfast, and they'd sit together at the small kitchen table, neither of them speaking much. It wasn't necessary. The silence between them was comfortable now, filled with an unspoken understanding. Sometimes, Marcus would ask about James's life. Small, tentative questions like how long he'd been a cop, or what his favorite kind of music was. It wasn't much, but it was more than Marcus had been able to share just a few weeks ago. James had started reaching out to some local social services, working with specialists who could help Marcus process the trauma he'd been through. He knew that the boy needed more than what he could provide. There were counselors who could teach Marcus coping skills, people who had experience working with children who had been through the kind of horrors Marcus had endured. But it wasn't just about getting Marcus into therapy. It was about giving him a foundation. He needed to feel secure, to feel that the world wasn't just a place of pain and loss. One afternoon, James arrived at the safe house to find Marcus sitting on the porch, a book in his hands. He hadn't seen the boy reading before. In fact, Marcus had been reluctant to do anything that required his focus or attention. His mind had been too jumbled, too cluttered with memories and fears. But now, the sight of Marcus absorbed in a book, a quiet, solitary activity, made James's heart swell with pride. The boy was trying. He was reaching for something beyond the pain. "Hey there, Marcus," James called out, a warm smile spreading across his face. "What are you reading?" Marcus looked up, slightly startled, but when he saw it was James, his posture softened. "Oh, it's a book I found in the living room. It's about some kid who's trying to survive in the woods." Marcus paused, his voice quieter now. "It's kind of like me, only I'm not in the woods." I'm in a house. James's heart clenched at Marcus's words, but he kept his smile steady, not wanting to break the boy's fragile sense of progress. Sounds like a good book, he said, walking over and taking a seat beside Marcus on the porch steps. What's the best part so far? Marcus hesitated, as though trying to gather his thoughts before speaking. The kid. He doesn't give up. Even when it gets hard, even when it seems like there's no way out, he keeps going. I like that part. I think I could learn something from him. James's chest tightened, but he didn't speak immediately. It took everything in him to keep his voice steady, to not let the emotion he was feeling show too much. You are that kid, Marcus, he wanted to say. You've been through more than anyone should have to, and yet you're still standing. You've survived everything the world has thrown at you. You're already learning from him, James said softly, his voice filled with quiet conviction. You're not giving up. You keep going every single day, even when it feels like the road ahead is too hard. That's strength, Marcus, and I'm proud of you for it. For a moment, Marcus looked down at the book in his hands, his fingers tracing the edges of the pages as if they were the first thing in his life that hadn't been tainted by pain. There was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, but it quickly faded as he closed the book and set it down beside him on the porch step. Thanks, Marcus said quietly, and for the first time in weeks, James heard a hint of something different in his voice, something like gratitude, something like belief. As the days continued to pass, small moments like this became more frequent. Marcus was slowly coming to terms with the fact that maybe, just maybe, he had a chance at a different life. A life where he didn't have to live in fear of the next day. A life where he could choose hope instead of survival. But even though things were better, James knew the road ahead would still be long. There were still deep scars that needed to be healed, wounds that couldn't be covered up with just time or words. Marcus had been betrayed by people he should have been able to trust. He had been hurt in ways that no child should ever have to experience, and those wounds would stay with him for the rest of his life. One afternoon, as James sat in his patrol car outside the safe house, he felt a shift within himself. It had been months since he'd allowed himself to truly grieve the loss of Mila. At first, he had buried it deep, telling himself that he couldn't afford to wallow in sorrow. He had a job to do, a responsibility to his community, and he couldn't let his personal pain interfere. But as he watched Marcus begin to heal, begin to trust, James realized something profound. He had been healing too. Slowly, over time, the gaping hole in his heart had started to close. It wasn't fully healed, and it never would be. But the sharp ache that had once consumed him had dulled, replaced by the understanding that, just like Marcus, he too had a future. And that future wasn't defined by loss. It was defined by the choice to move forward. James had been doing what he thought was best for Marcus, but in helping the boy find his way, James had found his own path toward healing. He was learning how to be present in the world again, learning how to hope again, just as Marcus was learning to trust. It was then that he made the decision to reach out to Marcus's aunt. It had been a difficult decision, one that he had put off for weeks, but James knew that it was the next step in the process. He needed to find out if there was any way Marcus could return to a family who would love and care for him, or if he would have to start fresh, building a new family from the ground up. The call to Marcus's aunt was hard, filled with tension, and at times, difficult to keep his composure. But it was necessary. For Marcus, for his future. James didn't know what the outcome would be, but he knew one thing. He would be there for Marcus, no matter what. Marcus, on the other hand, didn't know about the call. He didn't know what would come of it, but he had begun to trust in the possibility that there was hope for his future, hope for a better life. And for now, that was enough. As James ended his shift that evening and walked back to the safe house, he thought about the next chapter of Marcus's journey and his own. Neither of them knew exactly what the future held, but one thing was clear: they would face it together. They had already survived the worst of what the world could throw at them. And now, they would fight for the best.